Good evening and welcome to the Hatfield Museum and History Society September Community Program. My name is Larry Stevens. I'm the president of the society, and tonight we are broadcasting to you live from the research room of the new, recently opened Hatfield History Museum. For information on how you can plan your visit to the museum, just go to our website, www.hatfieldhistory.org, for complete details. Be aware that we are only open by appointment at this time to ensure social distancing and to keep everyone safe. Everyone who has been through the museum has raved about the experience, and you can check out the many great reviews we've received on our booking page. I want to thank everyone who has supported the museum with their society memberships and museum donations. And if you enjoy these live program presentations and all of the pictures that we post about Hatfield's history, maybe you would consider supporting our efforts with a financial contribution. A donation of any size is greatly appreciated. You can make a donation very easily right here on our Facebook page by clicking on the donate button. And 100% of donations go to the museum. Facebook takes no fees, so it's a great way to make your donation. Again, welcome, and I hope that you enjoy tonight's program. And now our video tech will adjust the camera. And while we are getting the camera just right, I want to remind you that you can hone your detective skills, your history detective skills, by participating in our Hatfield History Scavenger Hunt. Just pick up a form when you visit the museum and then follow the clues as you go around town looking for answers to a list of history questions. When you complete the form, bring it back to the museum for an I Love Hatfield History button. The scavenger hunt was designed to encourage interest in our local history for children, but adults will also enjoy the challenge, and it would be a great project to do as a family. So be sure to pick up a form when you visit the museum. In tonight's program, we're going to take a look at if these walls could talk, and take a look at the interesting past lives of some of Hatfield's older buildings. I'm going to start tonight's presentation with a look at this building, which is located at the corner of Main and Vine Streets. This building was constructed in 1827, making it the oldest building in Hatfield Borough. Back in the early 1800s, this piece of land was part of the South Hatfield Hotel property, which is now the Main Hotel. After the hotel owner, John Bookhammer, died, 2 acres of land was sold to his oldest son, Jacob, in 1827. It is believed that he built this building, the South Hatfield General Store building. Now keep in mind that this was at a time before the railroad was built through Hatfield, and the area was rather sparsely populated. In fact, in 1830, the population of all of Hatfield Township was only 835 people, and there were only 211 taxable properties. In 1857, when the railroad was built, with a station placed at the Cowpath Road crossing, a village soon began to grow, drawn by the convenience to rail transportation. This no doubt was quite a benefit to the store owner, as it soon greatly increased his customer base. This is the oldest photo that we have of the South Hatfield store building from around 1880. In 1865, Samuel Leidy was the owner of the store building property, and his son Jacob G. Leidy was running the store business. Also, in 1865, the Hatfield Post Office, established just 4 years earlier in a South Main Street residence, was moved to the South Hatfield store building when Jacob Leidy was appointed postmaster. And you can see the South Hatfield Post Office sign hanging from the porch roof. Now, some of you may recall from a previous program that in 1874, the train station was moved north from the Cowpath Road crossing to its current location at Broad and Market Streets. The following year, 1875, the post office was also moved out of the South Hatfield store and into a lumber feed mill business on Market Street. So South Hatfield lost the post office. In 1880, Jacob Leidy sold the store business to Eli Ziegler and Charles Myers. You might barely be able to make out the Ziegler and Myers name on the sign in the photo. And according to the sign, the store carried hardware, furniture, paint, oil, and glass. So for a decade and a half, the residents and businesses of South Hatfield were inconvenienced by the lack of a nearby post office. That changed in 1890 when the South Hatfield Post Office was established for the convenience of the South Hatfield residents. Charles Myers was appointed postmaster, and the post office was again located in the South Hatfield General Store. So there are now at that time 2 post offices located in the 2 tiny villages in the center of Hatfield Township. This photo is from around 1890. In 1897, Joseph B. Anders purchased the South Hatfield store business, and 7 years later, in 1904, he purchased the real estate. That is the Anders family posing in front of the store around 1899, and that's Joseph Anders at the far left. Here's a closer picture of the group taken that same day, and I love the large display windows with the hand-painted lettering, and check out the fancy glass in that beautiful front door. This photo postcard shows the South Hatfield store building around 1905. In 1907, Anders sold the store business to business partners Koffel and Huntsberger. This circa 1911 photo shows co-owner Frank Koffel standing by a team of horses hooked to a wagon float in front of his store, all decorated for Memorial Day, or Decoration Day as it was more commonly known back then. The sign on the wagon indicates that the store carried dry goods and notions, footwear, hats, groceries, vegetables, fruits, fish, and oysters. Most Hatfield longtimers will remember the South Hatfield store building as the home of Perry Bean's General Store. Perry Bean bought the South Hatfield store building and business in 1923. For a number of years, he operated under the Liberty Store's name. When you went to the store, you would give Mr. Bean your shopping list, and he would put your order together for you. This photo was from around 1943 and shows Perry Bean behind the counter in the store. Here's another photo from around 1943 showing Perry Bean and his son Perry behind the counter. In 1947, Bean changed his business model and began operating a self-service food market, which was apparently often referred to as Bean's Beanery. Perry Bean continued to operate the store until his retirement in 1958, at which point I believe the store business was discontinued and the space converted into apartments. Before I move on to the next building, I forgot to ask earlier, but drop us a quick comment and let us know that you're watching and where you're watching from. We appreciate that, and it's helpful just to know who our audience is. So thanks so much. Across Vine Street from the South Hatfield store was the Cope residence. This building was constructed around 1885, and in 1887, Dr. Leidy Cope purchased it and moved his medical practice here from Hilltown. A year earlier, Leidy Cope had married Sadie Ziegler, daughter of Eli Ziegler. And if that name rings a bell, it's because Eli Ziegler owned the South Hatfield store. So Leidy Cope purchased his home across the street from his in-laws. Leidy and Sadie Cope had 5 children: Roscoe, Webster, Ziegler, Emma, and Sarah. And it was in 1917 that Ziegler Cope saw a need in the borough and established a funeral directing and embalming business out of his family's home. Around the same time, Roscoe Cope was following in his father's footsteps and established a medical practice. Their brother, Webster, established a dental practice. And it is my understanding that at one time, all 3 of the brothers had their businesses in the Cope home at the same time. It was said that the Cope brothers could take care of you from cradle to grave. This is a photo of the Cope building taken around 1930. Notice that the section of Vine Street from the railroad to Main Street was at this time still a private stone road. This photo shows the funeral home around 1955. And an interesting side note, notice the cast iron planter in the left front corner of the property. The planter was also visible in the 1930 picture. I have heard that the planter was given to the Copes in lieu of cash for services rendered. I'm not sure if that is true or not, but it certainly is a possibility. Another picture from around 1955. Here's Ziegler Cope relaxing in his yard with the South Hatfield store in the background. Zig Cope, the last surviving Cope brother, continued to operate the funeral home until his death in 1957. His nephew, J.C. Kriebel, who had shortly before completed the requirements to become a licensed funeral director and had served as an assistant to his uncle for about 5 years, became Hatfield's second funeral director. When J. Kriebel was killed in a tragic auto accident in December 1975, his wife Rose continued the J.C. Kriebel Funeral Home business. Rose Kriebel eventually sold the business to Stephen Cligg, who operated the funeral home until 2007. And then the old funeral home building has pretty much sat empty since then, waiting for the right buyer to breathe new life into it. This photo was taken around 2016, I believe, and you can see the planter still on the property. Unfortunately, around 2018, the planter was removed and my efforts to locate it were unsuccessful. So after sitting on the property for over 80 years, the planter is now gone. Moving just 2 houses to the north on Main Street is 452 South Main Street. This old house is now apartments, but back in 1949, it was home to the Clausen Luncheonette. In 1955, the Clausen Luncheonette was the very first Hatfield restaurant to install air conditioning for the comfort of its patrons. The Luncheonette operated until 1968 when it was closed, but the sign pole still stands there, just waiting for the possibility of being used again. Up the road, just over the railroad tracks, is the Main Hotel, located at Main Street and Talmenton Avenue. This hotel long predates the borough itself. Again, looking at this 1840s map, you can see that the hotel, the yellow dot, was located at a major crossroad. This was before West Broad Street was built, and Tulminton Avenue was then a part of 40-foot Road. The original hotel built here was a single-story frame structure built around 1819. The first separate voting for Hatfield Township residents was held in that hotel building in 1822. The hotel's owner tried unsuccessfully several times to obtain a liquor license for his hotel. When he died in 1823, the property was sold to his son, who after 2 failed attempts was finally granted a liquor license in 1828. And there has been a tavern operating here ever since, almost 200 years. Now, as you can see, this was before the railroad was built, and it was still a rather rural area. And then the railroad was built in 1857, passing right by the hotel, with a station placed right across the street. The area soon became more built up, and by 1867, the hotel was apparently inadequate to meet the business needs and was demolished. The current stone 3-story building was quickly built to replace the old hotel building. The hotel tavern changed hands a number of times over the next 30 years, and in 1899, Jesse B. Schlotterer took over the tavern, and 4 years later, in 1903, he bought the hotel. This photo appears to have been taken in 1903 to celebrate Jesse Schlotterer's new business venture. And here's a closer look at the people. Presumably, that is Jesse Schlotterer on the left, with members of his family joining him for the photo op. Here's another photo from the same time, 1903, with everyone lined up to show off their horses. Notice that the South Hatfield Hotel building had a rather large cupola, the square extension protruding from the roof of the building. It is said that the hotel's cupola was used to direct cattle coming down the cowpath road when the road was just that, a cowpath. A man standing on the roof of the 3-story hotel could see cattle being driven down the road as far away as Montgomeryville, where another large hotel once stood. This gave the cattlemen gathered at the Hatfield marshalling yards time to prepare for the arrival of the drovers and their herds. The cattle, unmanageable beasts at best, could be driven more easily into fields and stockyards if a man directed operations from the hotel roof. When their work was done, the cattle drivers would be put up for the night at the hotel. It's not certain where the cattle came from or where they were going, but they came from both directions, and some would be sold to local farmers and dealers. Here's a view of Main Street in front of the hotel, taken around 1908. Notice the trolley tracks curving from the left bottom corner and running up the center of Main Street. This photo was taken a few years later, by which time the owner had done some improvements to the porch posts and replaced the wooden steps with cement ones. This is the back side of the hotel around the same time, and it really looked nice with the open porch all along the back of the building. The South Hatfield Hotel was the meeting place for various political rallies in the early 1900s. Prior to every election, rallies would be held to promote various political points of view. This appears, by the donkey on the bunting, to have been a rally held by the Hatfield Democrats. In the early 1900s, it was not uncommon to find a barber shop in the local hotel. A 1908 Hatfield Times newspaper advertisement indicates that Louis J. Hunold's Palace Shaving Parlor was located here in the South Hatfield Hotel at the time, and boasted, "Ladies' hair shampooing a specialty, no waiting, 3 barbers working every evening and Saturday afternoon and evening." In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the fields behind the hotel, in addition to being used for cattle, were also used for turkey auctions, with turkeys being brought to Hatfield on rail cars from farms in the south. The turkeys, chickens, and geese, as many as 4,000 at a time, were unloaded here at the South Hatfield Hotel or sometimes up at Knight's Hotel and sorted into groups and sold at auction. The Hatfield turkey auctions were so big and so popular at that time that tiny Hatfield Borough was given the nickname of Turkey Town. In 1928, the changing economy brought an end to the turkey auctions and Hatfield's claim to fame as Turkey Town. The fields behind the hotel then became a baseball diamond, which didn't hurt the saloon business either, as both players and spectators of the game worked up a powerful thirst. And back then, when you bought a giant mug of beer, you also got a free lunch. The end of the bar would be piled high with all sorts of cold cuts, cheeses, sausages, pickles, and other mouth-watering snacks, with the bartender keeping a wary eye out for freeloaders. This was a time of high unemployment, and some men had to resort to living in the barns of the neighborhood. But when they managed to scrape together enough coins to cover the cost of a beer, that also qualified them for the privilege of the accompanying free lunch. Naturally, a nickel beer went a long way in those days, but it must have been a chore for the tavern owner to determine just how much lunch time a man was entitled to for his bar money. At some point during Jesse Slaughter's ownership, he decided that the hotel would be known as the Keystone House. And you can make out the new name painted on the side of the hotel behind the tree. Here's another view of Main Street in front of the hotel, looking north, taken around 1923. A July 1944 advertisement in the Hatfield Times named Arthur and Edwin Frederick as the proprietors of the Main Hotel. This is the earliest reference found using that name for the building. 4 years later, though, in 1948, an advertisement indicates the hotel was operating as Hunsicker's Hotel, owned and operated by Charles Hunsicker. In the 1950s and 60s, William Rissmiller ran the hotel tavern business, again returning to using the name Main Hotel. A 1967 article in the Reporter newspaper stated, "In spite of its age, the Main Hotel manages to keep up with the times under the management of its energetic owner. The building includes 25 double rooms and 3 apartments, in addition to the bar, lounge, and restrooms." It went on to say, "The bar was recently enlarged to house a pool table, which joins other modern devices, such as a color TV, jukebox, hi-fi radio, and a shuffle alley. Advertised as a working man's hotel, the rooms are usually filled, and the bar seldom lacks thirsty customers." The hotel changed hands to John Groller from 1971 to 1984, and then Ted and Pat Brennan from 1984 to 2005. And now Greg Campbell is the proud owner of this historic Hatfield landmark. Further north on Main Street is Casey's Saloon and Eatery, located at 210 South Main Street. This building had its start around 1945 when Russell Anders, who had a food market in rented space on East Broad Street, decided he wanted his own building and built this one. This is Russ and Laura Anders in their new store in 1945. They operated their food market until 1955, when it became Ted's Market for 2 years. In January 1958, John G. Umstead of Lansdale, seen here, took over the building and opened the Speedway Grill. He soon applied for a state liquor license and to the Borough Zoning Hearing Board to serve alcohol on the premises, which was highly contested by many in the community and subsequently denied by the Zoning Hearing Board. He appealed the decision to the courts, and in July 1958, the judge issued a decision favorable to Umstead, permitting the operation of a bar at this location. The name was changed to Hatfield Speedway Bar and soon sold to J&J Lounge of Lansdale. The Speedway Tavern was a popular pit stop for fans after a night of racing at the Hatfield Speedway, and it was a rather rough place at times. In fact, I believe at least one shooting occurred at the Speedway Tavern. The Speedway Tavern continued to operate, I believe, until the early 1980s, and folks have shared that they believe that various other businesses have operated out of the building, including the Ketch Tavern, Ed's Place, and Bubba DeFinis's Rib It Up. I wasn't able to confirm this information, but if anyone else out there can confirm it, I would be glad to hear from you. Just drop us a comment. I do know that in 1987, William and Terry Loeffler purchased the property and opened Casey's Saloon and Eatery, and it has been that business ever since. Right next door to Casey's is the Anders Building, more commonly known as the old bowling alley building. You may recall that Joseph B. Anders owned and operated the South Hatfield store for a number of years until he sold it in 1907. Mr. Anders was quite a prominent man in the early years of Hatfield Borough. He apparently was a cattle and hog dealer in the late 1800s, and around 1896 he joined in the profitable business of selling turkeys. In fact, Anders became such a major dealer of turkeys that in 1908, the Hatfield Times dubbed him Turkey King of Pennsylvania. Anders also served as postmaster for a number of years, and the post office was located in his South Hatfield store. In 1909, 2 years after selling the South Hatfield store, Anders contracted for the construction of a building at the corner of Main Street and Blaine Avenue, where he operated a second-hand shop. A June 1909 Hatfield Times newspaper article reported A.Z. Ziegler will open a restaurant, pool parlor, and bowling alley in the Anders Building, Main Street and Blaine Streets on July 1st. Mr. Ziegler will run the place in an up-to-date manner and ask that the public give him a share of their patronage. The restaurant apparently operated under the name The Central Restaurant, and on this 1914 map, it indicates that in that year, Mr. Anders sold secondhand furniture on the second and third floors of the building and secondhand wagons and harnesses in the rear of the building, which had an earthen floor. The restaurant, pool parlor, and 2 bowling alleys were operating on the first floor. On December 1st, 1917, Abram Ziegler sold the bowling alley, pool parlor, and restaurant business to Horace R. Davis. It's not known if Davis operated the alley at all, as he was already operating a restaurant in the basement of the borough schoolhouse at this time. He did apparently eventually move the pool tables into his new building on East Broad Street in 1922. By 1922, additions had been constructed to the south side of the Anders Building, and the Pennsylvania Manufacturing Company, a manufacturer of wooden children's toys, was operating in most of the building. At some time, certainly by 1931, the bowling alley pool hall business was operating as the Hatfield Recreation Center. From 1932 to 1946, champion bowler Irvin P. Wireman was the proprietor of the Hatfield bowling alleys and pool hall. Although this 1940 photo is unfortunately a bit out of focus, it is the oldest one that we have of the Anders building. In May 1949, the Hatfield Times reported, "The soda fountain at the bowling alley is under new management of Russell Trauger and his son Kenneth. Known as the Russ and Ken Fountain, they will serve late lunch and soda." Hatfield High School took advantage of a hometown alley and organized a bowling team for the school. This photo shows the 1953-54 bowling team with Coach Jerry Bauer, who recently passed away, in the back. This is the only known photo taken inside the bowling alley when it was active. The Hatfield Bowling Alley operated under the name Stillwell's Bowling starting in 1960. A number of men, I'm sure, can recall their younger years as a pin setter at the Hatfield Bowling Alley. Although Brunswick patented the first automatic pin setter in 1958, that technical improvement never made its way to the Hatfield alleys, and young men continued to perform this rather hazardous, low-paying job until the lanes were closed in the late 60s, I believe. I also learned recently that according to one former Hatfield resident, there was a basketball court in the building on the floor above the bowling alley. Can anyone else confirm that? Drop us a comment if you can. A number of other small businesses have operated within the walls of the Anders building. There was the Recreation Barbershop, operated by Samuel Santo Farina from 1930 until 1937, when he sold it to Peter F. Taverno, who was formerly a barber at the Tremont Barbershop in Lansdale. Hatfield Borough's chief of police also supplemented his income as a police officer by operating Kreider's radio and television service at Main Street and Blaine Avenue, presumably in the Anders building, from around 1946 to 1955, before moving his business to the Knight Barn building. And here's how the Anders building looked in 2014, and it looks pretty much the same today. And behind those windows on the first floor, the original wood floors of the bowling alley still remain. Or at least they did in 2013 when this photo was taken. Almost across the street from the Anders building is the former Culp Feed Store building at 211 South Main Street. You have probably driven by this unassuming building 1,000 times, not knowing its interesting early years. Much of the land in this area, south of Lincoln Avenue, was part of Isaac Culp's large tract of land. It was in 1866, at the age of 34, that Isaac Culp bought 24 acres of land on Cowpath Road from his father, Dillman Culp. On this piece of land, Isaac Culp built a 3-story brick house, which stands today at 235 South Main Street, just south of Gottschall's garage. On this property, he conducted a feed, flour, baled hay, and coal business, and did some farming. In March 1872, his barn, hay house, and feed house were all destroyed by fire. Mr. Culp rebuilt the barn about where Gottschall's garage now is, and also built a new feed house right next to the new barn. In 1883, Isaac's son, Dillman Lincoln Oberholzer Culp, at the age of 16, opened a printing business in his father's office in the feed store, where he did some commercial printing on a small scale. In 1885, from this building, he published Hatfield Township's first weekly newspaper, which he called the Hatfield Mirror. The 4-page newspaper was too big a task for Culp's modest printing equipment, so he had it printed in Philadelphia. The Hatfield Mirror was short-lived, however, possibly because of the complications of having it printed in Philadelphia. That didn't discourage the young entrepreneur, though, and some years later he purchased his own building and his own printing equipment and restarted publishing a weekly newspaper, which he called the Hatfield Invincible. By 1910, when this photo was taken, Dillman Culp had taken over his father's business and was operating Central Coal and Ice Yards, selling high-grade family coal, ice, hay, and grain. Also, according to the sign, he did moving and hauling work. According to an old map, Culp also operated a restaurant in the right side of this building. This photo is from about 2 years later, around 1912, and shows the automobile of Elmer Culp, Dillman's son, on the right. So Elmer was apparently doing pretty well for himself. So now when you drive by this rather ordinary looking building just to the left of Gottschall's garage, which is now a double apartment, you will know that it had a pretty unique past. One only needs to look at this building at the corner of Main Street and Lincoln Avenue to know that it must have some story to it. The building was constructed in 1885, 13 years before the borough was formed. And it originally was just a one-room schoolhouse for Hatfield Township students living in the villages of South Hatfield and Upper Hatfield. The villages were growing rather quickly back then, and by 1890, there were 79 students in grades 1 through 8 attending the school. To better accommodate the number of students, in 1892, a second floor was built on top of the original building, making it a 2-room schoolhouse. The borough was incorporated in 1898, and the following year, the borough purchased the schoolhouse to be used by all school-aged children living in the borough. Shortly after the borough purchased the school, they added 2 more rooms to the north side of the building, making it a 4-room schoolhouse as seen in this photo. An early 1900s news article said of the school, "It contains 4 rooms, large hallways, and basement, all of which are well adapted for the school purposes, such as pertains to light, heat, and ventilation. The location is one of the finest in the borough and practically in the center of town. Total number of students enrolled, 139. In the fall of 1911, the borough schoolhouse took its place in history as the location of the second fire call of the newly formed Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company. The fire company hand-pulled their chemical engine, just like the one seen here, from their station in the Borough Electric Substation building on Cherry Street, up to the schoolhouse for the report of a heater explosion in the basement. It ended up causing a great deal of steam, but there was no fire damage. By 1912, the school was educating students in grades 1 through 10 and graduating them after 10th grade. Those desiring a higher level of education would need to enroll in the Lansdale High School. And apparently, the school had some unused space in the basement because in 1916, it rented some basement space to Horace Davis, where he operated a restaurant. This only lasted a few years, and he moved his business out of the schoolhouse in 1919. By 1920, attendance at the borough school had grown so much that overcrowding was again a problem. Then in 1922, Hatfield Township and Hatfield Borough got together and agreed to create a jointure in the 6-6 plan, that is 6 elementary and 6 high school grades. The consolidated school building was constructed at the North Main Street Borough line for all of Hatfield's school-age children. The former Hatfield Borough School building was eventually sold and converted into 8 apartments in the 1940s. In 1944, Heidelberg Church on Lincoln Avenue started the Hatfield tradition of playing Christmas carols over a public address system in the old bell tower of the former Borough Schoolhouse. Various churches, individuals, and organizations would provide the recorded music, which was broadcast through the amplification system and enjoyed throughout the borough. This tradition continued until around 1953, and it was about that time, I believe, that the bell tower was removed from the old schoolhouse building. As I mentioned earlier, Dillman Culp started his Hatfield printery business at the age of 16 in his father's feed mill store. Dillman went on to operate a number of businesses and owned a number of different buildings around town. Briefly, this one on East Lincoln Avenue at Poplar Street, where he briefly operated a restaurant. His father, Isaac Culp, had built this house around 1872. It was taken down in the 1960s to make room for the open pantry convenience store on that corner. I'm behind a slide. There we go. That's the picture of the building at Lincoln Avenue and Poplar Street where Dillman Culp operated a restaurant for a time. Now, on the other side of the creek, Dillman Culp also owned this building. Unfortunately, with its many renovations, this old building is but a shadow of its former self. And unfortunately, we don't have any really old photos of this 2-story building at 64 East Lincoln Avenue, which was constructed by Dillman Culp and his son Isaac in the late 1800s. Back then, the property extended back to include the area where the Meadowbrook Apartments now are. Dillman Culp operated a restaurant from here for many years. Now, I'm not certain, but this photo could possibly have been taken in front of Dillman Culp's restaurant in the early 1900s. You can barely make out the restaurant sign at the top of the photo, and 2 relatives both believe that the young fellow from third from the right is a young Horace Inky Davis. So it's possible that this could be that restaurant at Lincoln and Poplar. A 1908 advertisement for Culp's restaurant boasted that he had the best bay oysters, 50 cents per 100. Dillman's sons Isaac, Harry, and Elmer Culp all operated a grocery, produce, and fish market together from the building. To the rear of the restaurant property, where the parking lot is currently located, Culp built a dam to create a large spring-fed pond. In this aerial photo, the dot is the restaurant, and I have highlighted the creek in blue for your reference. And if it's not really blue, you'll have to forgive my color blindness. And there, you can make out the shape of the pond behind the restaurant. In the winter, ice was cut from the pond and moved to their ice house by way of an ice chute where it was stored to be used for refrigeration in warmer weather, both locally and shipped as far as Philadelphia. Earlier, I mentioned that Horace Davis operated a restaurant in the basement of the Borough Schoolhouse. History books tell us that Davis moved his business out of the schoolhouse and to the basement of Dillman Culp's building in 1919. This would seem to make no sense for a restaurant owner to rent space in his building to another restaurant owner, unless perhaps they weren't in competition with each other. Perhaps Davis served a luncheon crowd only, while Culp catered to the dinner crowd. This is only speculation, however, but we do know that this situation only lasted a few years until Davis built his own building in 1922. Dillman Culp sold the building around 1937 to his daughter Mary May Miller, who obtained a liquor license and operated a business under the name Oriental Cafe. She ran the restaurant for the next 25 years, although in 1957 she did offer to sell her property to the Penn Valley Recreation Center, a group of borough and township residents formed to look at possible locations for a community pool. The PVRC did not accept her offer, and she continued the business until 1962, when she sold it to Angelo and Caroline Giardino. The Giardinos offered a very limited menu, consisting only of hot and cold sandwiches, which were served along with alcoholic beverages. But still, this small local tavern became a popular meeting place where community members would gather to catch up on the day's gossip. In 1972, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Butera, both Italian immigrants, became the owners of the Hatfield Tavern. In 1980, major renovations were made to the Hatfield Tavern. One side of the building, up to this time, was a residence, with the tavern being on the other side. Due to an increase in patronage, the once single-wall bar was changed to a U shape in order to seat more customers. The half of the building that was the residence was renovated into 2 large dining rooms, seating a total of 94 guests. The Buteras continued the business for 28 years until their retirement in 2000. The business has changed hands a number of times since then. It reopened briefly as DeBill's Restaurant, and then Schmoxy's Inn for a while, and now it is Hat Trick's Sports Bar and Grill. Almost across the street, I touched on this building in my last This and That program, but for those of you who missed it, this small building on East Lincoln Avenue, right next to the creek, which is currently a home, originally served a much different purpose. It was Hatfield's print shop for over 45 years. The Hatfield printery business changed owners and moved around quite a bit after Dillman Culp started the business in his father's feed mill store. Around 1912, it was moved to this building with Clinton Addison as owner, where the Hatfield Times newspaper was printed, as well as other commercial printing. Those are the trolley tracks running along the side of Lincoln Avenue, and they were removed soon after this photo was taken when the tracks were relocated. In 1917, Mr. Addison hired Harry E. Brunner to be editor and publisher of the Hatfield Times newspaper. Here's Addison and Brunner posing in front of their building that year, 1917. You can see that the tracks are no longer there and a new cement sidewalk has been installed. C.R. Addison soon got out of the printing business and sold it to Harry Brunner in 1920. This is a 1943 photo of the print shop. Mr. Brunner continued to run the print shop until 1955, the year this photo was taken, when he sold the business to Edward Bonakemper II, owner of Bonakemper Typesetting on Coffle Road. Bonakemper, that same year, changed the name of the weekly newspaper to Penn Valley Times. In 1959, in order to more efficiently run the newspaper business, Bonakemper moved the operation in with his typesetting business on Coffle Road, and in 1960 began advertising this Lincoln Avenue property for sale. In November 1961, after 6.5 years as publisher of the Penn Valley Times, Ed Bonekemper stepped down and Howard Berger assumed the position of publisher of the paper. Berger was not with the newspaper long, and by January 1963, Bonekemper was again publishing the newspaper. Later that same year, though, Bonekemper sold the newspaper again, but kept the printing business, and the newspaper went to W.F. Gettler of Souderton. Mr. Gettler moved the newspaper business office back into its former home, this building on Lincoln Avenue, although the actual printing was done in Souderton. This building continued to serve as a newspaper office until about 1965, when the Penn Valley Times newspaper was purchased by the Souderton Independent newspaper, and this office was closed. This is how the building looked in 1970. A few other businesses operated out of the building after that. A carpet store, I believe. Write a comment if you know of any others. The building at some point, though, became a residence, which continues today. The Trolley Stop Deli on East Broad Street, a quite familiar Hatfield landmark, of course previously served as the Hatfield Trolley Station. But before that, it served as home to another business. In fact, it wasn't even at this location. The building was originally constructed in 1903, built by Hatfield businessman George S. Snyder on his East Lincoln Avenue property. A few years earlier, George Snyder had purchased this prime piece of real estate at the corner of East Lincoln Avenue and Market Street and built a most extraordinary house, a mansion really, designed by famed Lansdale architect Milton Bean. Nearby, on Lincoln Avenue, he constructed another building, this one seen here. It was located right around where the small cottage is now, on the Paradise Manor property. This new building Snyder rented out to Mr. Clinton Addison for his Hatfield printery business. That's right, the Hatfield Trolley Stop Deli building was previously a print shop. Here's an interior photo of the print shop from around 1908. Mr. Addison ran his printing business here for almost a decade, printing the weekly Hatfield newspaper, the Hatfield Times, and other commercial printing like calendars, posters, flyers, and invitations. Those of you familiar with the Trolley Stop Deli are sure to recognize the inside of this building. Notice that this was at a time before electricity had come to the borough. And that is Mr. Addison sitting in the chair. This is an advertising postcard, also from around 1908, showing Mr. Addison at work at his desk in the print shop. Around 1912, the Lehigh Valley Transit Company, which operated the trolley line through Hatfield, decided to relocate its tracks to remove them from the borough streets. They also wanted to add a station in the borough, and they approached George Snyder about the building he rented out to the printer. Snyder agreed to sell them the building, which is how Mr. Addison ended up with his new building just up the road a bit. The trolley company relocated the former print shop building over to East Broad Street, where it served as the trolley station for the next 40 years. A freight platform was also added to the station in its early years, giving local businesses an option to the railroad for the shipment of goods. Folks don't often think about it, but the Trolley Stop Deli has a second floor, which is currently office space for the store. Around 1941, when this photo was taken, it appears by the sign on the side of the building that the second floor was used as the headquarters for the Hatfield branch of the Washington Camp Patriotic Order Sons of America. The Patriotic Order Sons of America, founded in 1847, is one of America's oldest patriotic and fraternal societies. This photo shows the men of the Hatfield group lined up in front of the Hatfield Borough School building at Main Street and Lincoln Avenue, taken sometime in the early 1900s. The trolley company enjoyed strong patronage through the early 40s as World War II raged on and made car ownership difficult. After the war ended and the economy improved, more families were able to afford an automobile and trolley ridership declined. By 1951, the year this photo was taken, trolley ridership had declined to the point that it was no longer profitable. The Liberty Bell trolley line was discontinued and the trolley station was closed. The building apparently sat empty for a number of years, but then in 1955, the second floor was leased to Donald Davis, son of Horace Inky Davis. Don Davis operated the Liberty Bell Art Shop in the former trolley station, selling art supplies of all kinds, ceramic and other handicraft supplies, picture frames, and homemade pottery, watercolors, and oil paintings. The business operated here until the early 1960s. In 1964, Raymond Reds McGinn partnered with Hatfield pharmacist Robert Porter to purchase the former trolley station and open the trolley stop, offering groceries and dairy products. An addition was built onto the west side of the building in 1971, and the store began to offer hot and cold sandwiches, calling itself Trolley Stop Deli. Now this was a time before 7-Elevens and Wawa's, and the borough's textile business was still going strong. And the Trolley Stop Deli was open 7 days a week from 7 a.m. until midnight. Reds McGinn continued to manage the business until his retirement in 1994, when he sold the business. Sadly, patrons watched the decline of the quality of food produced by the new Trolley Stop Deli owner, and business tumbled. Then in 2005, Reds McGinn's daughter, Cindy McGinn Shull, and her husband Scott bought back the deli, and the old Trolley Stop Deli was back. And even better, with the addition of a hot foods counter for grab-and-go convenience and a coffee station with various flavored coffees. Reds and his wife Darlene even came out of retirement to help out by opening the store most morning. Well, Reds, Darlene, and Cindy are all gone now, but the legacy started by Reds 55 years ago carries on by a third generation. Melissa Rosenberger, the granddaughter of Reds and daughter of Cindy and Scott, took over the business, and with help from her aunt, Diane McGinn, the business is in good hands. Reds would be thrilled. Right next door to the trolley stop is the Davis Building, which was built in 1922 by Horace Davis. And remarkably, the building looks much the same now as it did when it was built back in 1922. After operating in the basement of the Borough Schoolhouse and the basement of Dillman Culp's building on Lincoln Avenue, Horace Davis finally had his own building where he could operate his restaurant. In a room in the back of the restaurant, off limits to women and children, he also offered a pool hall, or pocket billiards room, as it was called back then. While the business was officially known as Davis Restaurant, as seen on this old match holder advertising piece, most folks simply knew it as Inky's. In addition to the restaurant and pool hall, Davis also ran a news agency, selling a number of newspapers. It is said he received the nickname Inky because his hands were always black with ink from handling the many newspapers. Inky ran his business on the first floor of the building, which left the basement open for lease. His first basement tenant apparently was Edwin J. Coons, a Lansdale pharmacist, who wanted to open a pharmacy in Hatfield Borough, and so rented the basement of the Davis building. Here he placed a young G. Edgar Herzl, who had just graduated from the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, in charge of the pharmacy. Herzl would take the trolley from Lansdale into Hatfield each morning in time to open the pharmacy by 7 a.m., since that was the time that the milk train stopped in Hatfield and the local farmers were all in town to meet the train. In 1924, Coons sold the Hatfield pharmacy business to Doc Herzl, and Herzl continued to operate the store here until 1927, when a flood hit Hatfield and the pharmacy ended up underwater. And as you probably know, we just had a very similar flooding situation here recently. After being flooded out, the pharmacy was soon relocated to higher ground in the Knight Barn building next door. I'm sure it became apparent that a business that would not suffer great inventory loss from floods would be best suited for the basement of the Davis building. One such business was a barber shop, and Titus Skeet Schrager successfully operated a barber shop in the Davis building basement for many years, beginning in the late 1920s. His advertisements read, "The well-groomed man visits Titus Schrager's tonsorial parlor. Barbering for the particular." Around 1955, Skeets moved his barbershop to 12 West Broad Street, where it operated until 1966, when he sold the business to Dale Moyer. Harry Russo apparently took over the barbershop space in the basement of the Davis building, operating from 1961 until 1965. This photo of the Davis building is from around 1945. Also in the basement of the Davis building was Anderson Cleaners, which began operations in 1937. The business was operated by Conrad Axel Anderson until the time of his death in 1947, and then continued by his wife until 1960. In 1960, the business was taken over by Mrs. Maria Watson of Edgewood Drive and operated under the name Hatfield Cleaners. She operated the business for a very brief time, though, because the following year, in 1961, the business was operating as Deluxe Dry Cleaners, with Lee Ronan as the proprietor. Other businesses have operated in the basement of the Davis building since then. More recently, there was a second-hand thrift shop, as well as a sports card shop. And perhaps you know other businesses that have operated in there. Write us a comment if you can think of any. Upstairs in Inky's restaurant, he apparently became somewhat infamous for his hamburgers, which were also known as crumb burgers because they seemed to have more breadcrumbs than beef in them. He did apparently, however, make some very good tomato soup. This photo that you see here is from a picture postcard dated 1928. And the back of the postcard, addressed to Dearest Anne, reads, "Do you like tomato soup? Had a delicious one here Monday." So Inky apparently made a good tomato soup. Inky Davis continued to run the business until his retirement around 1975, and his son Robert took over the business. The luncheonette was closed a few years later in 1978, and in 1980 the building was remodeled and reopened as a cut-ahead hair salon, which continued successfully for many years. Since 2017, it has been home to Divine Beauty Boutique. Next to the Davis Building is Knight's Barn Building, perhaps the building that has seen more history than any other in Hatfield. The history of Knight's Barn Building goes back to 1873, when John Proctor bought a rather large piece of ground at the corner of East Broad and Market Streets, where he built a 3-story hotel tavern, seen here. At that time, this area was rather deserted, as you can see from this map of just 2 years prior. Although a nice little village had grown around the South Hatfield train station, where Mr. Proctor built his hotel was totally undeveloped. But the wheels were in motion to move the Hatfield train station from the Cowpath Road crossing a short distance north to within a stone's throw away from his new hotel. Proctor knew the area would soon be booming. And this map from 1877 shows that is just what happened. In just 6 years, the area turned into a bustling village. None of the buildings in this area were there 6 years earlier. The hotel property was all of the land in that triangle, up to and including land on the other side of the creek. Behind the hotel was a large barn, which served as a livery stable for the hotel patrons' horses. Though not of great quality, this is one of our oldest photos of Knight's Barn Building, taken around 1900. This is, of course, the Broad Street side of the building. And this is another 1900 photo of the barn as viewed from Lincoln Avenue. In 1889, the hotel tavern property was sold to Chester Knight. Upstairs, on the second floor of Knight's Barn, was Knight's Hall, referred to by some historians as the Knight Music Hall. It was a large meeting room that was a beehive of activity and rarely sat empty. It was in Knight's Hall that the citizens of Upper Hatfield Village and South Hatfield met in 1898 and decided to incorporate into a borough. And the borough's first polling place was in Knight's Hall. Many local groups made use of the hall for their meetings, including the monthly borough council meetings, the Hatfield Township School Board meetings, and scores of political gatherings which generally preceded the local primary elections. Both the Heidelberg and Grace Church congregations held their first services in Knight's Hall before building their churches in the borough. The Hatfield Township commencement exercises were held here, and the Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company held its organizational meeting here in 1910. So this building has certainly witnessed much of Hatfield's history. For many years, the grounds behind the barn was the site of bi-weekly cattle sales conducted by Mr. Knight. And at Thanksgiving and Christmas time, thousands of turkeys were brought to the property to be sold at auction. Notice that Turkey King Joseph Anders, discussed earlier, was in charge of this sale. By 1922, horses were increasingly being replaced by the automobile. And this Sanborn insurance map shows that some of Knight's Barn stable space had been converted into space for Carver and Castle's automobile garage and repair shop. He also had 2 gas pumps out on Broad Street. In 1924, J. Walter Snyder, seen here at the left, took over the garage space, starting his own garage business with himself as the only mechanic. In addition to servicing automobiles, Snyder also sold radios from his garage in the late 1920s and early 1930s. This photo is from around 1930, and by that time, Snyder had apparently hired these men to work with him in his garage. In the middle is Henry Groff, and Joseph Ruth is to the right. Walter Snyder continued to operate his garage here until 1939, when he built his own garage on South Main Street, which is now Gottschall's Auto Service. By 1927, most of the first floor of Knight's Barn had been converted into commercial space, and in 1927, the Hatfield drugstore, which had been in the basement of the Davis building next door until it was flooded out by heavy rains, moved into the Knight's Barn building. An American store business, run by Russell Anders, opened in the barn building next to the drugstore in 1937. And here's another picture of Knight's Barn building from around the same time, circa 1945. And a closer look at the drugstore around 1945. Chester Knight died on March 27, 1960, at the age of 99. And the hotel property was sold and soon razed. That's Mr. Knight in front of his hotel playing croquet with possibly a great-grandchild. The Knight Barn building was eventually sold to Robert Porter, who was by then the owner of the Hatfield pharmacy business. That's Bob Porter there standing in the doorway, and that's Lee Snyder hanging out in front of the pharmacy. For a number of years, until 1962, Hatfield Borough used the garage space in Knight's Barn building as the municipal garage. Then in 1962, the Hatfield Pharmacy expanded into the space that was previously the garage space, more than tripling its floor area. The pharmacy continued to operate until around 1984, when it was discontinued. A video store soon took over the space, and later a slot car racetrack was set up here. Currently, a laundromat occupies the former pharmacy space. Many other businesses have operated out of Knight's Barn building over the years, including Lund Brothers Flower Shop, and later Hatfield Florist, Sonny's Sports Shop, Crater's Radio and Television Shop, Dr. Donald Gurdan, the Yackel and Kyle Appliance Shop, and Hatfield Dry Cleaners. Now let's see how many others you can think of. Write us a comment if you can think of any other businesses that operated out of the Knight Barn building, and about when it was, if you can think of when that was. In 2007, a fire broke out in the old Knight's Barn building. It didn't look too bad when the fire company first arrived, but the flames quickly spread, fed by the dry 135-year-old wood, completely destroying the second floor and heavily damaging the first floor. Thankfully, the building, when rebuilt, was restored to its original look and maintained its historic character. Across the street from Knight's Barn is Zepp's Bakery. Most Hatfield long-timers probably remember it more as the old Savings and Loan building. It was in 1876 that James Deal purchased a lot at Broad and Cherry Streets, where he built a house and established a bakery there. He apparently wasn't able to operate the business profitably and it was soon closed. In 1892, Frank Zepp purchased the property and reestablished the bakery. Frank Zepp was a progressive-thinking man and worked tirelessly for his business and for his community, and was instrumental in the forming of the borough, first burgesses or mayors. This is the bakery shown on a 1908 map. The house had a porch that wrapped around the front of the building, and Zepp even had his own little ice house out back. After the First World War began in 1914, Frank Zepp gave the bakery business to his sons, Elmer and Jonas Zepp, so that he could focus on other endeavors. Elmer and Jonas continued to operate the business as Zepp Brothers Bakery. This photo was taken by one of the Zepp brothers, my guess would be Elmer since he was quite the historian, in front of a house at Cowpath and Orvilla Roads that was ravaged by fire back in 1925. It's difficult to make out, but the writing on the wagon there reads, Zepp Brothers Bakery, Hatfield, PA. The Zepp Brothers Bakery operated until 1940, when Elmer retired from the bakery to focus on the Hatfield postmaster position that he had been appointed to. Brother Jonas continued to operate the bakery route. In July 1948, the Hatfield Building and Loan rented space in the rear of the Zepp home in which to have their office. The 1950s were not good years for the Savings and Loan Association. They were victims of armed robbery twice in that decade, here in quiet little Hatfield. Fortunately, no one was injured in either incident. In 1956, the bakery business was completely discontinued, and Elmer Zepp sold the bakery property to the Hatfield Building and Loan. Later that year, the business changed its name to Hatfield Savings and Loan Association. And in 1957, the building underwent major renovations with new, modern, attractive offices fronting on Broad Street. This sketch was done from a photograph a number of years ago, but unfortunately I was unable to locate the photo. But this sketch gives you an idea what the building looked like around 1958. Another business that made its home in this building around that time was Pete Wyer's Barber Shop. Pete Wyer began his barbering career in 1929 across the street in Knight's Hotel. When the hotel closed in 1960, Pete moved into the Savings and Loan building, where he continued his business until 1973. Beginning on January 1st, 1962, Hatfield Borough started renting space in the basement of the Savings and Loan building to use as the borough office. In 1964, the Savings and Loan building was again remodeled, including an addition to the east end of the building, giving the association approximately twice as much office space. This is how the building looked in 1965. And you can see Pete Wyer's barber pole to the left. And who remembers that revolving time temperature sign? And here's another photo of the Savings and Loan from around the same time, 1964. A heavy rain in 1971 had the basement of the Savings and Loan building underwater, and also had the borough soon looking for a new space for its office. Also in 1971, the Savings and Loan purchased the adjacent Detweiler store property and demolished the building to make room for additional parking. Around 1973, the building was expanded yet again with another addition, and in 1974 the name was changed to North Penn Savings Association. The name was changed yet again in 1980 to Penview Savings Association, which continued to operate here in this building until 2003 when it was closed. Most recently, medical offices were located in the building, but they too have since closed. Across Cherry Street from the Zepp building is the former Ludwig Engineering Building, known to Hatfield longtimers as the old post office building. As mentioned earlier, the post office moved around a lot in the early years. In 1908, Jonas Moyer constructed this new building at Broad and Cherry Street for the Hatfield Post Office, as well as the office for his foundry and fence factory on Cherry Street. The post office stayed here from 1908 until 1914, when it moved to Lincoln Avenue. Sometime between 1914 and 1922, Jonas Moyer demolished this building and in its place built this larger structure. And in 1922, the post office moved back to Broad and Cherry Street, occupying the center section of this building, with the left and right sides leased out for other businesses. One business was a food market operated by J. Russell Anders. You may recall that Mr. Anders had operated the American store across the street in Knight's Barn Building. He sold that business and in 1939 opened his own business, Russ's Market, to the right of the post office. Here's Russ Anders on the right and neighbor Harry Reinhardt Sr. standing in front of the market's large display window. And here's another picture of the building from around 1945. In 1962, the post office was moved out of this building into a new building on North Main Street. The Hanson Textile Company soon purchased the building and installed a number of circular knitting machines in it, like this one here, which operated for a number of years. In 1984, Richard Ludwig purchased the building and ran his engineering business from it. He also leased the right side of the building to a number of hair salons over the years. The former Broad Street Firehouse building, unless you have been in Hatfield for more than 20 years, you will not even remember when the Hatfield Volunteer Fire Company ran out of this building. This building also has some rather unknown history. You may recall that Chester Knight owned all of this land at one time, and in 1925, he sold a 125-foot wide piece of land straddling the west branch of the Neshaminy Creek to the Hatfield Fire Company, on which to build a firehouse. So the fire company essentially had to build a bridge over the creek on which to build their firehouse. Although this is a rather low-quality photo reproduced from a newspaper, I really like it because it shows the new firehouse all decorated for its dedication ceremony celebration. Here's a better picture of the new firehouse. The firemen built their new headquarters with a vision for the future, meaning they built it larger than they really needed at that time. And the extra space they decided to lease to help pay their new mortgage. The Hatfield National Bank was their first tenant. This is bank manager Nelson Hartranft standing in front of the bank. The bank business also required the installation of a thick concrete vault built behind the new firehouse in which to put their safe. The bank operated here for 10 years until 1937 when they built their own building at the corner of Broad and Main Street. Shortly after the bank had vacated its space at the firehouse, John MacArthur became the new tenant and opened a grocery and meat market there. MacArthur, also the fire company's secretary at the time, rented the space for $30 a month. John MacArthur continued to operate the business until 1954, when he sold it to Vince Bowers. Bowers' lease was discontinued 2 years later in 1956, when the fire company decided that they now needed the space for fire trucks, and the store space was converted back to a truck bay. It is interesting to note that it's my understanding that the Hatfield police at one time used a small basement space in the firehouse as a shooting range where they could do some target practice. Has anyone else heard about that? Let me know with a comment. For many years, that fire company Ladies Auxiliary served public meals as fundraisers in the firehouse apparatus room, where the fire trucks were kept. That is, until 1970, when a new 40-foot by 80-foot banquet hall addition to the firehouse was constructed. The ladies now had a dedicated, comfortable space in which to serve their meals. The Broad Street Firehouse continued to serve the fire company well for another 30 years. But as fire trucks got larger and heavier, the fire company had to question the wisdom of storing millions of dollars of heavy firefighting equipment on a 70-year-old bridge. And in 2000, they moved into their new station on Market Street. The old firehouse has had a number of uses since then, including a food truck business, a caterer, and now the new owner, Salter's Fireplace Patio and Grill, is busy renovating the building into their new showroom. One final building, and then I'll wrap it up for tonight, and that is this building at the corner of West Broad Street and Columbia Avenue. The building was constructed around 1925 by local businessman Jonas Moyer, and in 1928 leased to Joe and Irma Duke, where they operated the Sunset Tea Room. This is a sketch done by Sarah Duke Swartley of the sign that was in front of the tea house as she remembers it. Unfortunately, we have no old photos showing the front of the building, so use your imagination. Sarah remembered that the brick building had a large front room used as a lunchroom, with tables and chairs, 4 booths, a counter with a cash register, and a row of windows across the front wall. This is a 1930s view of the Columbia Avenue side of the building. There was a kitchen with a gas stove and sink, a dining room, and a large sitting room in the rear. A bathroom was also located in the rear, and a hallway led to 2 bedrooms. A rear porch served as home for several rabbits raised in pens by Joe Duke. Irma served lunch to local business people. She was known for her apple tarts, raisin pies, and lemon meringue pie, with Smith's ice cream from Doylestown. On Saturday nights, dating couples would often stop in after the movies to enjoy ice cream sundaes and Irma's homemade pies. Here's Sarah Duke standing behind the building. As you can see, you were able to fill your gas tank behind the tea room back then. The Dukes had to give up their business from 1929 to 1930 when they moved away to care for a relative, but when they returned, they again operated the tea room for a few more years until 1933. In 1936, Harry and Mary Monahan took over the tea room and operated it as Monahan's Tea Room, advertised as, "Next to home, this is the best place to eat. Rooms for tourists near Hatfield Fairgrounds." The Monahans operated the tea room until around 1946. I know of no other businesses operating here after that, and believe it must have been converted to apartments around that time. And that's it for tonight. Well, thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the program. And until we meet again, I wish you a good night. And stop in and visit us at the museum.